So Pedro Gonzalez is warning Republicans against just dismissing legislation for a $15 minimum wage out of hand. In a new opinion piece, he highlights how ineffective the conservative free market has been when it comes to working class people.
Pedro's point, CEOs in 1965 made 20 times as much as their company's typical workers. Today, that's 320 times their employees. A result of legislation over the years has allowed them to pad the pockets of themselves. So assistant editor at American Greatness, Pedro Gonzalez, he joins us now to discuss his case for a $15 minimum wage a bit further. Pedro, thanks for joining us, man. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
So go into a little bit of your argument here about why you're going against the grain, so to speak, and talk about some of the pushback that you've received from traditional conservatives and why you think that it's not very valid.
So the basic point of that article is, obviously I wrote in defense of the $15 minimum wage because there's a bill right now that everyone's talking about. So I came down, like you said, on the unpopular side, defending this from the right. But I think the most important takeaway from that piece is this: wages and benefits do not rise or improve for anyone that the economic power structure is not designed to serve. That's important because conservative orthodoxy today insists that the proper and only real way to raise wages is by cutting taxes and slashing regulations. And if we do that, the wealth is just going to trickle down and wages will rise as sure as the sun. But that's just not true. Wages don't rise for anyone who doesn't fight for them. And that's really the key point of that article. And so I went through, for example, the Trump administration's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. According to conservative theory, that should have improved wages for everyone, right? What actually had the opposite effect. It mostly transferred wealth upwards. For the first time in American history, you had the wealthiest people in this country paying far less in taxes than the people at the very bottom. Instead of using their savings to invest in their workers, increasing wages, instead you had a trillion dollar stock buyback spree. Mm-hmm. And instead of creating more factories and therefore more well-paying jobs, instead we had more jobs offshored under the Trump administration's first term than Obama's first term, because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act incentivized that. So I think this is actually the most important part of that argument.
Yeah, and you've been somewhat of a lonely voice on the right, along with Sagar and a few others that we like to have on the show.
Yeah.
In that particular critique of the Trump administration, because that's in violation of some of his core promises that he made on the 2016 campaign trail. I think it's really important for people to understand you're not like not some lefty who's always hated Trump.
He's also not like a Lincoln project.
Right, or like a Lincoln.
Right.
You wanted him to succeed. You wanted him to deliver on the promises that he ran on in 2016, but you've looked at the data and seen that he fell short, especially with the tax cuts that mostly went to the wealthy and to large corporations. Why don't you think that we've heard more of a critique from the right on on the merits of, hey, you said you were going to do this, and that's actually not what happened?
Right. Fear, I think, because it's not just the left that has this kind of, you need to say these things in order to be part to sit at our table, right? Conservatives also have that. If you want to work at the Heritage Foundation, at the American Enterprise Institute, these organs of conservative thought, well, you have to subscribe to a certain set of ideas. And it's mostly the same, I think, for a lot of legacy conservative publications. And so for someone like me, and I exist outside of these things, I live in the Midwest, I don't live in the Beltway. And so I guess I'm kind of immune to it because I have no desire to be part of these circles. And so I think I can look at things more objectively than people whose employment is maybe contingent on them saying the right things, right? And so I really think that that's been an advantage for me because the interesting thing is, while I've seen very loud voices, very prominent voices on the right come out against me for writing this, I've also received a lot of private praise for this from people in those circles saying, basically, thank you for writing this. I might not agree with the $15 part, but the basic point that we have to fight for these things and they're not just going to happen on their own, I completely agree with that. That's actually been the most common response, but it's also been mostly in private messages.
Yeah, and that's the amazing part. And that's what I want you to go into. Let's talk about some of the people who came out against you and how, many of them are connected to Cofunded organizations who are created specifically in order to attack views like your own.
Right. Well, going through a few. You had the Heritage Foundation. I really liked their line of attack, which was basically, if we raise wages, that might mean that, quote, parents will spend more time at home with families.
Oh, we can't have that. That'd be horrible.
Right, that's just absolutely. It's basically communism. And you had the American Enterprise Institute basically say that this was bailouts, and bailouts are bad and bootstraps are good. But the funny thing about, sorry, that's not the AEI. That was the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Bailouts bad, bootstraps good. Well, organizations like TPPF actually love bailouts from like the gas and oil industry. The gas and oil industry received something like $10 billion from the federal government to bail them out during the coronavirus pandemic. TPPF's so much of what they do is underwritten by donors in the gas and oil industry. So they're actually totally fine with the government picking winners and losers as long as the government picks their donors as the winners. And like you pointed out, many of these are in like Koch Industries, for example, is one of these. The American Enterprise Institute also kind of framed it as like, this is bad for families. This is not family values. Conservatives are pro-family, therefore this bad. But the funny thing about AEI is that they're also one of these organizations that worked with Purdue Pharma to basically run cover for OxyContin. And tell people that actually this drug is not addictive, or it's less addictive than other things that are based on this chemical makeup. And the result of that was basically fueling the opioid crisis. And something that people don't talk about a lot is that you actually had an increase in child and infant mortalities as a result of opioids, including I don't know how children would get their hands on like OxyContin, but this is actually a thing that you saw ODs for even in children increase. And again,
that's true.
Is that family values? That doesn't sound like family values to me.
Horrible.
And Pedro, you've taken a lot of heat here that I've seen. And something in particular you said recently, which I thought really struck a nerve amongst a lot of people that a lot of people didn't want to hear. You said a vote for Trump 2024 is a vote for Jared Kushner. Obviously, that is true. But maybe can you explain exactly what you meant by that and how it dovetails kind of into the op-ed that you wrote here?
Well, Kushner was... I think this is difficult for people to understand because when we think of Trump, we think of this kind of like domineering figure and kind of like he runs the table, right? And this is how the media frames him. But in fact, Jared Kushner was kind of like the prime minister of the White House. He was really at the center of a lot of policymaking. And there was very little that happened under Trump that did not receive a stamp of approval from him. And so what you got was a president who ran as a populist, who campaigned against Wall Street, against tech companies, but then delegated all authority and so much decision-making power to Jared Kushner, who did the exact opposite of what Trump campaigned on. He created a vehicle that acted as a kind of pipeline between not just Wall Street, but also Silicon Valley and the White House. It was called the Office of American Innovation. Right. And that became kind of like the main policy shop in the White House, and it was run by Kushner. So again, I think it's difficult for a lot of people, especially on the right, to understand. But when you're voting for Trump, you're actually just kind of voting for someone who's going to be a figurehead. And in some ways, it's actually very similar to Biden. This is a common criticism of Biden, right? That Biden's kind of just at the wheel, but he's not really driving the car. That I'm sorry to say this for conservatives, but that's really kind of how Trump operated. You got the law and order tweets, and you got the rows with the media, but really it wasn't him who was really running the show.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point.
Very interesting. And also very interesting that the media didn't have any interest in scrutinizing that aspect because they liked the narrative of Trump, the domineering figure, and as the singular personality. Pedro, great to have your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Of course. Coming up, a Reddit user is getting sued after that GameStop debacle. We're going to discuss the details when Rising continues.